Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Stéphane Widry, ILSI Global Executive Director, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th session of our ILSI annual symposium. This session is addressing alternative protein. So I'll start maybe with a short disclaimer. The views expressed in the following presentation are solely those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of ILSI, and each speaker had the total freedom to present his presentation. So I'm happy to welcome our co-chairs. So first, Louise Dye. She is Professor of Nutrition and Behavior in the School of Psychology and Academic Lead for the University of Leeds. And also, she is the president of ILSI Europe. I'm also happy to welcome Catherine Lefranc. She's qualified as Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and has a PhD in biotechnology, and she's a senior researcher manager at Roquette in France. So Louise and Catherine, the session is yours.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your area. Thank you, Stéphane, for your kind introduction and for giving me the nice opportunity to chair this exciting session in the company of Louise, even if I regret that we won't be able to join for a drink all together after the session. I'm very pleased to introduce this session on alternative proteins that will focus on a very timely topic, requiring various skills to better understand how to help mitigate the environmental impact of our food system and try to provide innovative and realistic solutions to feed the ever-growing human population around the world. For that, we will have 4 speakers, Mr. Blake Byrne, who will speak about scalable technologies for the production of alternative proteins. Dr. Armando Perez-Cueto will give an overview of the landscape and market of alternative proteins from a consumer perspective. Dr. Clare Mills will speak about food safety considerations of alternative proteins. And finally, Dr. Emanuele Zannini will talk about nutrition and alternative proteins. So before leaving the floor to Louise, who will now present in more details Dr. Blake Byrne, just a few words about the organization. So each talk will last 20 minutes, followed by 5 minutes of questions from the audience. And I would like the speakers to really respect the schedule, and we will help in switching off our cameras and opening it back 2 or 3 minutes before the end of the talk so that you are aware that it is almost finished. And I would also like to ask the participants to pose their questions by using the chat box, and we will take many questions at the end of each talk. So Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you everyone for attending today. I'm really delighted to introduce Blake Byrne to you. Blake leads the Good Food Institute's Science and Technology team, and where they try to understand the input, the infrastructure, and the investment needs of scaled alternative protein production. So he's doing market research, building models, and writing reports, and has a forthcoming 2020 report on cultivated meat state of the industry. And I think we'll let Blake tell us all about this presentation on these scalable technologies for the production of alternative proteins. Over to you, Blake. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, and thanks to ILSI. And my apologies in advance if my connection is not excellent. I will take myself off of video for the moment. There's a construction crew outside, and I think we wiped out my connected phone at the moment. So my video is going off, but I suspect you all can see my slides, and that will be the focus of the next 25 or so minutes. So really pleased to be here, and in as few words possible, what we'll be discussing today is a look at alternative proteins, and alternative proteins is GFI terms. It is really the use of plants, the use of microbes or microbial cells via fermentation, and the use of animal cells and animal cell culture to create products that are conventionally produced via animals. So in the purposes, or for the purposes of this talk, we'll primarily be focusing on the production of meat via these alternative platforms. And really what I want us to hone in on here is their potential for scalability, as well as the pricing potential of these products. It is GFI's thesis that in order for alternative proteins to really take off in this industry, they have to taste the same or better, but ultimately they have to cost the same or less as commoditized meat, egg, and dairy products. But I'll plant a flag here and just start by telling you all a little bit about GFI. Some of you all may be familiar and others certainly not. And so GFI is an entirely donor-funded nonprofit. We really exist to advance both the markets and the technology of alternative to conventional animal products. And so we do so not only in the United States and in the EU, but also throughout Brazil, in Israel, and India, and throughout the Asia Pacific as well. We have about 100+ staff in these regions and really focus our efforts on 3 key programmatic areas, if you will. The first is science and technology, the team that I am on, and the science and technology team really focuses on advancing kind of the open access foundation for the alternative protein industry and ensuring that we're creating basically a sound foundation of science and a pipeline of scientific talent to essentially serve as the next generation of science and technology in alternative proteins. Our corporate engagement team, this team really focuses on working with the largest food and meat companies in the world, all the way down to just an entrepreneur with an idea, and helping companies and entrepreneurs craft theses around alternative proteins. And in the cases of large food and meat companies, actually developing strategies to help them transition their supply chains from, say, conventional meat production to alternative protein production. And then finally, our policy team. So our policy team works in not only efforts to create a fair playing ground for alternative protein products, both again in the US and elsewhere, but also advocating for an infusion of public sector funding into alternative proteins, really seeking to establish alternative proteins on a level playing field with clean energy as an actual solution for a green economy and for mitigation of things like climate change. So I'll transition us now a little bit to a framing in which I think a lot about in my time at GFI, and it's the concept of total meat. And this idea, of course, is really the idea that today globally, we produce in the neighborhood of 350 million metric tons of meat via conventional means, via animal husbandry, every single year. And of course, by 2050, in the next 20 to 30 years, that demand, and ultimately that production, is expected to increase by nearly 50% to 500 million metric tons of meat production every single year to satisfy growing meat demand. Now, of course, you can see in the top left of the screen that alternative meats, meat from plants, meat from microbes, and meat from animal cell culture, these products are really a rounding error of the overall global meat market. And as it stands today, this massive earth system that we have, conventional animal agriculture, produces a vast volume of meat, which in many ways is cheap and affordable, and it tastes good. That's a reason why it is the predominant system. But of course, as many of us know, this system that we've created does quite a good job in certain contexts of providing cheap and delicious protein, also has really disproportionate externalities on our planet. So I won't, belabor you all with the details of kind of the issues with conventional animal agriculture, aside from saying, conventional animal agriculture, as we know, is a significant contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. It is a massive utilization of our total global arable land mass. And it is fundamentally a system that relies on an efficiency of feeding crops through animals to create protein, albeit delicious protein. And then finally, there are significant kind of public health concerns when it comes to conventional animal agriculture, which again, many of you are familiar with. And again, this is essentially just a kind of a parcel of the system which we've created. Today we use in the neighborhood of 2/3 to 3/4 of all antibiotics globally pure animal husbandry, industrialized animal agriculture. And if you ask the WHO, they will say that this utilization of antibiotics in agriculture and in animal agriculture is a significant threat, not only to kind of human health, but to global human health. And so we think that there are ways in which, of course, we can produce meat while eliminating some of these really onerous externalities. So at GFI, our organizing question and what I kind of go into my day with every single day is how do we get to this state of the world where we're really producing some, most, or even all of our meat by 2050 via these alternative protein production platforms. And of course, as I've referenced here, the three production platforms, which I'm going to go into detail with more kind of on the technical side of things here in a moment, are plant-based meats, they're fermentation-powered proteins, and then cultivated meat as well. So in all of this, and as I referenced, second slide, ultimately our theory of change, if you will, is that, you know, for these three production categories, the only way that they kind of emerge from an obscure small segment of the market, kind of this niche play, to being viable, scalable, industrial alternatives to conventional meat is if we optimize these production platforms for price and if we optimize them for taste. These products have to taste the same or better, and they have to cost the same or less than conventional meat products. Now, once we do that, it is our belief that you take out all of the other considerations around animal welfare, around environmental calculations, public health, all of the things maybe that some of us care about on the alternative meat side of things, but ultimately we just want to provide a product to consumers that they gravitate to on their own, regardless of the considerations, regardless of those externalities which we've discussed. So how do we get there? The way that we get there, and certainly the framing that we take from the perspective of our science and technology team, is we really have to break out each of these three production platforms into their constituent parts. Now, you can see here kind of the fundamental, and we think about this almost in almost in technology terms or almost in software development terms, kind of the technology stack of each of these different production platforms. So you'll see here the tech stack for plant-based meat, the tech stack for fermentation-derived products, and the tech stack for cultivated meat. And what I'll do in the ensuing few slides and with the remainder of my time is I'll zoom in on kind of one area of the tech stack of each of these three production platforms to give you all an idea of kind of how we think about these products and their horizons and how we can optimize them again to reach those goals of price and taste parity. So we'll start out with plant-based meat. Now, as many of you all will be familiar, plant-based meat is not a new concept necessarily, and it's existed really in iterations for centuries, and in kind of its current iteration for at least a decade or two. And historically, or at least over the past, say, 50 years, the way that plant-based meat has predominantly been produced is via an approach, a manufacturing approach called extrusion. Now, extrusion, again, as many of you all will know, was not initially developed and today is not exclusively used in the plant-based meat industry. It was initially developed for the plastics industry. It has been used historically for manufacture of things like snacks. And we have essentially retrofitted extruders in order to turn plant proteins, typically plant protein isolates or concentrates, into TVP or textured vegetable protein, really trying to replicate the experience of conventional meat. Now, the way that we do this via extrusion, both low and high moisture extrusion, is to apply pressure and heat, and then some degree of moisture, of course, in order to persuade those plant proteins, that plant protein concentrate or isolate, to act more like the fibrous protein, which is typically found in animal meat. The upside, of course, with this kind of canonical or prevailing approach of extrusion that you'll see on the left is that we can produce it quite a high throughput. So it seems to us to be quite a good solution right now if we want to be able to produce a lot of plant-based meat to satisfy non-trivial percentages of that global meat market. satisfy non-trivial percentages of that 350 million metric tons. But of course, there are frontiers, there are ways that we need to continue to optimize the texture and both the texture and the flavors of the products that are extruded, the extrudates themselves. There are also, of course, emerging technologies to manufacture plant-based meat. So shear cell technology and spinning technologies are really just two of a variety of new kind of generation approaches to texturizing plant proteins, to creating plant-based meats that bear organoleptic resemblance to conventional animal meats. Shear cell technology, quite an interesting approach, developed initially, I believe, out of Wageningen, a leading ag university in the Netherlands. Now, this approach seems to be quite favorable because we are able to better recapitulate the experience, the fibrous structure of conventional animal steaks or whole muscle cuts. And likewise, spinning technology is potentially quite interesting in its application to plant-based meats. Of course, spinning technology emerging largely from the textiles industry, the weaving industries, and the theory and potentially the practice is that you can create these long fibrous, essentially strings of plant proteins, which are better replicating that fibrillar structure of conventional meats, particularly steaks. As well, of course, we would be remiss not to mention 3D printing approaches. Now, the reason why I mention kind of the near-term stretch question mark here is not because of our questioning the ability to replicate the experience of conventional meat. Actually, 3D printing may be able to do the most precise job of faithfully creating a facsimile of, say, a steak, a filet mignon, if you will. But the question here, of course, with 3D printing is always the throughput. It's always the volume, the production volume. How much of it can we produce? And can we produce at a price that is amenable to commoditized meat products? And so that is the main fundamental, or it's a fundamental question, at least for me, when it comes to 3D printing. But it's an interesting approach nonetheless, because right now it can likely get us as close as possible to the actual true experience of consuming conventional steaks. Now, oftentimes when we think about the question of taste in plant-based meats, we initially gravitate, kind of our minds initially, or at least for me, gravitate towards the flavor, the taste of plant-based meats. But ultimately, and as I've kind of alluded to, we're not going to crack this code unless we optimize for texture. And I just wanted to show briefly an example here that some of you all may be familiar with. This is coming from a company called Juicy Marbles. There are other companies taking similar approaches in the industry as well. And they're using a manufacturing approach, which I referenced on the last slide. But essentially, the upshot here is that, think about this is a company that has existed for a few years, no more than 2 or 3 years. They've got a team of 3 to 5 people. And in that span of time, in an infinitesimally small span of time, they have been able to create a product that at least kind of prima facie, on its face, it bears pretty striking resemblance to conventional steaks. And this is a team that was able to do this in a few years with, not even a few $1 million. Now expand this concept out using these technologies, these texturization technologies, incorporating fats as well as muscles from plant proteins a decade out, and extend that to hundreds of millions of dollars of R&D, right? Put Impossible Foods and Beyond Meats' entire R&D teams and budgets on this question of steaks, and imagine what we are going to be able to produce a decade out. If this is V1.0, the horizon is quite striking and quite favorable in terms of its prospects. So I won't go any deeper there on the plant-based side of things in the interest of time. I will transition briefly to fermentation. Now, as it pertains to fermentation, GFI really instantiated fermentation as a third pillar of the alternative protein industry last year in our fermentation state of the industry report. So published in 2020, recommend you checking it out if you want to go more deep on fermentation. What I will say here is that really we categorize fermentation broadly as falling into 3 subcategories. The first is traditional fermentation. Of course, traditional fermentation has been utilized for centuries and actually millennia to essentially using microbes to modulate different food and beverage processes. of course, brewing with beer, creation of cheeses and yogurts, but also for the purposes of plant-based meat, use of soybeans to modulating soybeans with things like rhizopus. So again, it's a strain of a microbe in order to create tempeh. And there are ways in which we can use this traditional fermentation approach to create better and better plant-based meats. Likewise, there's biomass fermentation. Now, biomass fermentation has existed actually for quite some time in the alt protein industry, largely by virtue of a company called Corn in the UK. They use a strain, to my knowledge, it's Fusarium V, in order to, create a mycoprotein, which consumers have had access to for many decades. Now, some of the exciting frontiers, or actually I'll take a step back there, the exciting kind of theoretical prospect of using mycoprotein in biomass fermentation, where the consumer is actually eating the cells, the microbial cells, the mycelium itself, is that mycelium, by its very kind of fundamental biology, seems to better replicate that fibrillar structure of animal proteins, or proteins that are traditionally found in animals. Therefore, this may be an interesting subsector if we are trying to optimize for whole muscle cuts of steak. There are companies that are innovating kind of the next generation of biomass fermentation. It includes companies like Atlas Food Co. They spun out of Ecovative, as well as Emergy Foods in Boulder, both creating really compelling whole muscle cut prototypes. Now, finally, I'll transition us to precision fermentation. Now, precision fermentation is, as a technology, is really synthetic biology in practice. And we have used precision fermentation in industries spanning from chemicals, enzymes, biofuels, and certainly in the biotherapeutics industry, using it to produce things like monoclonal antibodies. And here, as it applies to food, it is the theory, right, that we can take proteins that are traditionally found in animals, dairy proteins, egg proteins, etc., encode those genes into the genomes of microbes and have the microbes produce those molecularly identical proteins and other molecules of interest. So it's basically a hacking of the biological system, and it's a way that we can create precise animal proteins without the animal itself. So I want to hone in just briefly on this concept of precision fermentation, kind of this top bucket up here. And we'll look at kind of three brief applications of precision fermentation. I briefly reference them, and then just talk about kind of some of the cost considerations. So a company like Perfect Day and many others are creating dairy proteins like whey via microbes. A company like Clare Foods in the Bay as well, they're producing egg white proteins, things like albumin. And then Impossible Foods, which is traditionally really considered a plant-based company. Of course, their hero, or their magic ingredient, heme, is produced via precision fermentation as well. And they all use a variety of different, they likely use fungi, not bacteria. Most of them probably use Pichia pastoris or another common strain. But the upshot here is that they are able to produce proteins historically found in animals, but they're able to do so via microbes. Now, from a cost perspective, what we have to think about when we are trying to optimize this precision fermentation process, particularly as it applies to food, is the cost profile. And when it comes to the cost profile, there are two things that I'll highlight briefly here. One is the titer. This is basically the grams per liter that we are able to express those proteins in a given amount of microbes. When we're thinking about the kind of titer of these microbial expression systems, we really need to optimize their overall yield, or well, the titer and the yield, if we are able to get, or if we are trying to get them to a price point that is competitive with conventional animal products. In addition to the titer, just the pure amount of protein that is expressed via these microbes, we must think about downstream processing, which really in many ways emerges as kind of the main cost driver at scale of this precision fermentation process. Now, downstream processing theoretically is just the idea that you separate out the microbe that is expressing the protein from the protein itself, say the whey, because we just ideally want to use whey in some degree of purified format to incorporate into various products. So we may use technologies or techniques like centrifugation to separate out those two kind of sub buckets, the microbe and the protein of interest. And of course, we can use technologies like spray drying to actually create usable formats and powders of these different proteins. And again, on the downstream processing side, in a variety of industries, if you think about biotherapeutics, these companies are oftentimes incentivized to create extremely high value proteins because they're going in our bodies. But at the same time, they don't have to think as much, at least, about the cost considerations of the processing because they're able to charge super high margins on their products. In the food industry, we really need to focus on either creating somewhat less pure products so we can reduce the cost profile, or creating better systems for purifying proteins at a lower cost, again, so that we're able to move down the cost curve. Now, finally, I want to briefly talk about cultivated meat, animal cell culture, cell-cultured meat, cell-based meat. You've probably heard all sorts of terms. The only ones that I won't particularly advocate for are lab-grown meat and Franken meat, but I think that's for another discussion. So cultivated meat, as many of you all will be familiar with as well, is kind of the concept that we can take the cells directly from an animal's, typically in kind of the format of a biopsy, although we can engineer other cells, iPSCs and the like, take cells from animals and we proliferate them outside of the animal's body and ultimately are able to create a molecularly identical meat product, but just obviating the need for the actual animal husbandry. This is often taking place in a bioreactor, likely a stirred tank bioreactor, and we are using not only muscle cells, which are found in meat, but fat cells, so adipocytes, as well as a variety of, other cells which are going to be necessary, things like fibroblasts, satellite cells. There are a variety of additional cell lines that must be considered. But nonetheless, the basic theory is we take the cells from the animal, we proliferate them in high density in a stirred tank bioreactor or something similar, and then ultimately use techniques developed from the tissue engineering space in order to perfuse or seed those cells onto a scaffolding that will then recapitulate or kind of create that experience of a meat product. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go much deeper here, but I do want to talk about the key to cultivated meat. And again, this is the difference between cultivated meat being some scientific oddity that, you hear about in a few journals and then it fades away to the dustbin of history, versus cultivated meat being the predominant way that we feed billions of people with meat every single day for the millennia to come. And of course, the difference between those two bifurcated potential states is the cost. And when it comes to cost, there are a variety of considerations. I will mention 4 of them here, and they emerge from a recent, or actually a few recent, techno-economic assessments of cultivated meat. One is we have to focus actually in a similar, quite a similar manner to the fact that we need to optimize the cell lines, the microbial cell lines for fermentation. We must focus on metabolic engineering approaches in cultivated meat to increase the cell's potential for high density culture. There are considerations around viscosity. There are considerations around ensuring that we are limiting the CO2 in the cell culture or in the bioreactor, because the CO2 can inhibit cell growth and ultimately kill the cells, and ensuring that the cells themselves in the bioreactor have access to sufficient oxygen, and then kind of inhibiting as well various catabolites that are produced as a result of the cell culture and proliferation. Likewise, cell culture media. Cell culture media is right now a predominant cost driver of cell cultured or cell-based or cultivated meat. When it comes to media, there are a variety of different discussions that need to be had and research projects that need to be undertaken. One that I think is particularly interesting and tractable is the concept of sourcing amino acids that will comprise the cell culture media from plant hydrolysates. Right now, the industry that predominantly uses cell culture media, the biopharmaceutical industry, the life sciences industry, isn't terribly incentivized, if you will, to reduce the input costs of media, because again, they're playing in a relatively high value market with relatively low volumes of media. When it comes to cultivated meat, we're flipping that paradigm on its head, and we are producing, or we intend to produce, in extremely high volumes, right? Hundreds or millions of metric tons, and at an extremely low value, right? We are trying to produce commoditized meat. In order to do so, one opportunity to reduce costs is actually to use various plant proteins, again, things like soy protein, and source amino acids from them so that they will ultimately be cheaper inputs into cultivated meat. We can also, just briefly here, look at strategies like media recycling to reduce the overall cost of goods sold. And it's important to recognize as well that as cultivated meat scales up, today it's about the pilot scale, we intend for within the next, 5 to 7 years for it to really move into industrial scale production. Well, once we move cultivated meat into industrial scale production, the facility capex, the capital expenditure, the steel in the ground, the pipes, etc., that will become a predominant cost driver of cultivated meat, kind of the unit price, in the same way that it did in the biofuels industry. And we have to find ways to reduce the facility capital expenditure if this is going to be a feasible investment for investors, for capital providers who are looking to supply this industry. So I will round us out on this one last slide. And I just want us to take kind of a holistic look of these 3 different production platforms for for alternative protein production, and think about them on these 2 kind of metrics here, right? Organoleptics, the ability to replicate the experience of conventional meat or ultimately beat the experience of conventional meat, and then also price. How can we produce it super cheap? Right now, if you look on the right side, plant-based meat, from a price standpoint, we think we can get to price competitiveness with conventional meat really within the next few years. The question is, can we improve the organoleptics of these products to a point where we are, again, indistinguishable or even better from conventional meat? The question of cultivated meat, of course, is, one, we think theoretically, and from the products that we've tried, that these products will be organoleptically identical to conventional meat products. That's the promise, it's the holy grail. But at the same time, we have to ensure that cultivated meat moves down this price curve here so that it is ultimately competitive from a pricing standpoint with the conventional meat industry. Lastly, fermentation. It does an incredible job of molecularly recreating animal proteins. But again, it's a reasonably expensive process right now. Can we move down the cost curve so that these products are better able to compete with conventional meat products? Last thing that I'll say is we kind of talk about these 3 separate buckets. Already today, Impossible Foods, their burger, is a hybrid between fermentation and plant-based. Perfect Day and their ice cream is a hybrid between their precision fermentation whey and their plant-based other ingredients in their ice cream. These 3 categories will essentially merge. And so we will think about them really as one unit as opposed to 3 separate pillars. So with that, I will yield my time to the floor, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Blake. That was really fascinating. I don't see any questions in the text, but I'll just ask if anyone's got any questions. I was really pleased that you mentioned ice cream at the end because I'm not very fond of steak. So I felt there was something for everyone. Any questions?
Well, I'll mention there, Louise, that I've got some of Perfect Day's ice cream in my freezer at the moment, and it is quite remarkable just to think about all of the R&D, the science that went into it, and ultimately it's a tasty product, so would recommend.
Excellent. Okay. I think Claire has actually got her hand up. Claire, can you unmute yourself and ask a question? Yep. I don't know, we can't hear you, Claire.
We can't hear you.
Try again to unmute. It's the green thing on the side. Yeah, it should be okay now. No, we can't hear you. So
perhaps I will have a question. You mentioned, Blake, the objective to have perhaps less pure products or at a lower cost. But for example, for plant-based proteins that I know more than the others, how to deal with the taste?
So I'm sorry, the question, Catherine, is how to deal with the taste if we're optimizing for lower purity products.
Sorry?
So is the question how to optimize for taste if we are creating purity products?
Yeah.
Certainly. So it's interesting. I mean, in the fermentation space, right? You could actually imagine this situation, right? So if you think about various plant-based meat products, they actually include yeast extracts as kind of a flavor additive in many cases. So you could imagine, and again, this is a thought experiment, Impossible Foods is not doing this right now, but you could imagine them using the microbial strain to actually express heme, which obviously is kind of their hero ingredient. But instead of isolating purely the heme from that production process, if they had a microbial strain that was amenable from a flavor standpoint to incorporation, they could just take that entire end product into the production directly to their ingredients. Now, it's a difficult technical question, but it is, I think, achievable from that standpoint. And the beautiful thing, of course, is that we ultimately, like if you think about Impossible Foods, right, they only need 2 to 5% of heme of their product by weight to really recreate the experience of meat, kind of that meaty flavor.
Yeah.
So we can produce these ingredients at quite a low volume as a percentage of the overall product and still get that organoleptic resemblance.
Okay.
That
I'm
sounds
unmuted. Am
Claire,
I
you've
unmuted?
you are, yes, and that's really a relief. Do you want to ask a very quick question?
Just very quickly, the role of GM in the precision fermentation, and really whether consumers will accept that, or whether that will be something that might be patchy in different parts of the world. And I just wondered what you thought about that.
It's an excellent question. So one, I will say full disclosure, I am probably I'm not the best person to ask this question because I am very science forward, admittedly being on the science and technology team. I think you're absolutely right that the regulatory landscape, it could be extremely patchy. That ultimately consumers are going to gravitate towards the product that are delicious, that can compete with meat products. If you look at the sales in the United States of Impossible Foods, for instance, of course, that uses precision fermentation, they use genetic engineering to produce their, is not largely with consumers. The other piece that I'll mention obviously has differences than the EU, but in the US, like 90% of the soy that we produce, which is the vast majority of the feed that goes to the animals that we then eat, is of course produced via, or in many ways via genetic engineering. So already the food landscape is comprised of products that are bioengineered. But again, I'm jaded and biased, so there it goes.
Okay, thank you very much, Blake. I'm going to pass to Catherine to introduce our next speaker. Catherine.
Yes, we are now switching to the second talk of this session. So it's entitled Alternative Proteins, Consumers and Market Landscape. It will be presented by Dr. Armando Perez-Cueto, who is Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen, Department of Food Science. He is also Deputy Head of Research Group on Sensory and Consumer Research. He has consolidated his area of research on behavioral interventions to promote sustainable, healthy food choices. And he collects regularly consumer data and investigates behavior change strategies at the Future Consumer Lab in Copenhagen. So Armando, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my my screen? Yes, the main screen is there.
Yes, we
So
can.
I start a slideshow somehow.
That's fine.
Yes, so you can see it. Huh? Thank you very much for your kind invitation and the kind introduction to to my talk. Before we continue, I need to disclose that I don't have financial conflicts of interest, but I have a personal conflict of interest. I have a daughter that she's 3 years today, and today humans still destroy and kill almost everything on the planet. And as many other citizens and consumers, I want her to grow in a world where humans embody goodness, restoration, and benevolence towards other people, animals, and biodiversity. And that's what gives me the energy to do research and do my work. So I will give a brief introduction to this alternative proteins kind of business talk. And first, what are these alternative proteins? And alternative proteins refer to all those proteins that are actually not from animal origin. And if you see from when it comes to plant-based proteins, it refers to a continuum from unprocessed protein-rich plants, and there you have pulses, you have pseudo cereals like quinoa, amaranto, cañawa, or you go through more processed products as they were mentioned earlier, tofu, wheat, and with fermentations, for example, tempeh, to highly sophisticated biotechnology that combines ingredients from multiple plant sources in order to mimic the experience of meat. But that's not the only part of alternative proteins. Alternative proteins are also other relevant sources. There are fungal proteins. You speak about mushrooms, mycelium, yeast. There are side stream proteins, for example, the cake of soy, the cake of beer production, the cakes of oat production, etc. We heard about cell-based cultures or cultured meat, and there are also insects and algae and so on. So what is important here is that when we are speaking of proteins, and particularly from the perspective of the consumers, we should be very careful of not losing the big picture. People usually eat foods, they don't eat nutrients. And when we move the communication towards nutrients, we obfuscate the consumer, we obfuscate the citizen. So we can lose the big picture by reducing food into single nutrients. And there is quite some effort around proteins, but proteins don't exist isolated. They exist in structures, in different kind of structures that are important for human health as well. So who are today's consumers? I think it's important to address that there is a segment that is growing very much, and it's those that practice conscious consumerism, which is a waiver of people that actually purchase and make their buying decisions driven by commitment to positive social, economic, and environmental impacts. Some examples of that, of course, are the youth that have been mobilizing before the pandemic and the lockdown through Europe and many other places in the world, asking the older generations, basically asking all of us, to stop messing with their future, because it's in their lifetime that climate issues will just come even more evident. It's going to be in our lifetime. So there's a pressure also from the younger generations, and although this figure is a bit old, it also shows that a socially conscious consumer is usually younger, that socially conscious consumer is green, and they believe that companies should support the environment. So it's very supporting the environment is becoming and has become the most important cue from consumer perspective, and these consumers are willing to pay for more socially responsible products and services. So there are different consumer segments. If you think of consumers according to their eating behavior, you have omnivores, and of interest for this talk, we have plant-based eaters, whether they are vegetarian, vegan, pescatarian, or any of those other options that you have, like fructarians and so on. There are different classifications. But of particular interest is the segment of flexitarians. Flexitarians, it's a group of people that has been growing in the last few years. It is a very inclusive category because it includes the name itself. It speaks about being flexible, so it includes very flexible number of people according to their eating behaviors. Some people would call themselves flexitarians and still eat more meat than the lower quintiles of omnivores in some of the surveys. And the definition is very, very broad. If someone goes and reads the paper of Derbyshire in 2017, there's like 20 definitions of flexitarianism. However, flexitarianism is one of the first steps that people take when they are engaging in dietary shifts. Of course, there are other consumer segments of relevance, particularly when you think of dietary transitions. We would say that the younger generations, they are called millennials and Generation Z, they are driving the demand side for sustainable, ethical, and healthy food. And paradoxically, although they are younger, and you would always suspect that younger people are having less income, but they are the ones that are demanding more products that are ethical and sustainable. Generation X, which is the people born before 1980, they are adopting the changes, and particularly the COVID has confronted people with their own mortality probably, but the fact that they are aging and that being able to be at home and cook by themselves, there is a possibility for them to change. And older consumers, there is sufficient evidence that they can be that their eating behaviors can change under the right interventions. So I want to focus a little bit on the market and business potential of the plant-based sector. First, this is a paper that we published last year, and I think it can serve as a kind of frame for the business perspective of plant-based food and protein. According to this paper, consumers will perceive plant-based diets as ethical and environmentally friendly. They need products that are convenient, that are tasty, as it was mentioned earlier, and particularly that have a simple ingredient list. It's important to mention that there are lots of beliefs, perceptions, and understanding towards alternative protein products that need to change, in particular those regarding plant-based foods. And meat replacements should be healthier and they should have a clean label. I need to make the point that at this moment, the case for the healthiness of alternative products is very little, because most of the studies that have related health with the levels of processing have been based on data that existed before these products were put in the market. So there is very little actually known of the actual health effect of these products, these extruded proteins, or other products. However, the other thing to say is that policy context and market trends point towards increasing business opportunities. And within smart protein in the consumer work package, our colleague Kai-Britt Bechtold produced this report on the plant-based sector overview for Europe. And we can see that in the last 2 years, from 18 to 20, there has been a 49% increase in the sales value of the plant-based food in Europe. And that important that the total European plant-based sector, of course, is mainly in Germany, UK, Spain, and Italy, and that it's growing in other countries. But it's a growing and blossoming market. It's comparable to what happens in the United States, with growth of 15% between 2017 and 18, 11% between 18 and 19, and 18, 19, 12, and 27%. I'm using data that I found from Good Food Institute, that is the same organization as the previous speaker. And compared to the there is a comparison between the animal-based and the sorry, there was a problem with this slide. The animation didn't go well, but anyway, there is the total plant-based foods showed 43% dollar growth, household penetration of 57%, and 78% people are purchasing it. So I will provide you some consumer insights for innovation in alternative proteins. We had a recent consumer survey that was carried out in Denmark, Germany, and Spain. We identified 4 respondent groups: those who don't eat animals with high plant consumption, low animal consumption, high plant, moderate animal and plant, and high animal and moderate plant consumption. And here, what we see is the interest in alternative protein ingredients in the segments and in the 3 countries. So the most preferred ingredient for or source of proteins is legumes and pulses. It is very the area of insects. You can see that it's doubtful in many ways. The combined half meat, half protein systems are mostly accepted, but by a percentage of people in the higher meat consumption, but not necessarily accepted in the lower consumptions. And at least for the moment, there is very little interest in cultivated meat. And when it comes to the different types of plant-based products that are of interest, we can see here that the winner is this B, is plant-based products with no meat-like taste and texture, suggesting that maybe the time is ripe for new food categories, for the development of new categories using plant-based foods. Moreover, revising some other papers and these ones, we see that there is a very clear winner in the order of preference towards the origin of alternative proteins. People prefer pulses and vegetables, algae, plant-based meat, cultured meat, and then insects. They are still behind, and mostly because of the disgust factor, particularly existing in the Western countries. Now, I want to mention also the paradox of taste and the hedonic experience, because this is a barrier to dietary change and a driver of dietary change. And I think when we are speaking about innovation, it's very important to take into account a barrier to dietary change is that people will declare to be attached to the taste of meat and dairy because of umami content. That's the main explanation. Umami is the deliciousness and is the savory taste. There is a lay belief that unhealthy is tasty. And also there's a lay belief that only foods of animal origin provide sufficient nutrition that will also be tasty. While for consumers that are more in the other groups, it's a driver for dietary change, because it increases dietary diversity, complying with the recommendations to eat more fruits and vegetables and foods of plant origin. It actually brings new sensory experiences to the consumer, because they are exposed to new textures, to new flavors, to new pleasurable experience at the table. So basically, in summary, consumers eat food, not nutrients, and they vote with their purchases. And we can see from the data, from the market data, that this trend is growing. The market is incipient, but is developing. Foods based on plant proteins are preferred by consumers. Insects, cultured meat, and mixed plant animal systems are in the beginning of their development, so they are at very earlier stages compared to plant-based foods. The plant-based food market is blossoming in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere. I think new categories should be developed, for example, protein-rich pasta or spreads, but maybe we need to just be ready for categories that exist on their own right. Consumers' cues of ethical, environmentally friendly, convenient, tasty, simple ingredient list, and healthy are important in future development. And I think taste is a facilitator for dietary change, predicts long-term adherence, and should be advocated as a public intervention. So thank you very much to ILSI for the invitation, and I acknowledge the support of I work now with the Smart Protein and Protein to Food, both European projects.
Thank you very much, Armando, for this very interesting overview. So I don't see any new questions from the audience.
I'd love to jump in with a question. Thank you so much, Armando. I found that to be fascinating. You know, my question is, you know, the slide that you show, right? It's like it's the spectrum from insect culture, least amenable to consumers, to pulses and other vegetables, kind of whole pulses, being the most amenable. But it just strikes me as like, right, like for me personally, of course, I would love it if everyone ate, if the base case was the kale hypothesis, that people gravitated towards kale and whole vegetables. But when we look at the production volumes and the global system of conventional meat, the data seems to show that, and again, this is to me, that's really on the technology side, the data seems to show that people are only going to gravitate towards things that are absolutely delicious. How do we think about advocating for expanding the definition of meat, or what is delicious, in a world where, frankly, at GFI, we're just trying to create products that cost the same or less and taste the same or better than conventional meat products?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and probably almost impossible to answer. But I think, but I have some ideas that might help in the broader context. So taste, for example, can be developed combining different. The umami taste can be developed, you know, with the mushrooms and onions and garlic and tomato and so on. So it is possible to get to delicious and nice products from that are different somehow from meat. The deliciousness is something that is is actually underrated, because people buy what they and rebuy what they like. So I think that's a key factor that we need to to work in a way that consumers will experience the taste also based on the cues we have. So we have done some experiments in the lab, and that I have published some years ago. That it also depends on what you tell to people, how they will evaluate their hedonic experience. So if you tell them, well, try this product and evaluate what your liking is, they will give you a mark. But if you tell them that on top it helps to the environment or has this ethical aspect, or their experience would be better of the product. So I think we need to go beyond just what we can measure with instruments, and make a more holistic behavioral intervention, if you know what I mean.
It's very interesting. The last thing that I'll just toss out there is it just strikes me as if, you know, in some of the high level consumer research I've seen, it seems as if kind of the stated preference of consumers oftentimes is kind of they want healthy products, but ultimately when we see kind of their revealed preference, what they're actually purchasing, the taste seems to be kind of that key driver. So it almost seems to me, and again, I think I'm potentially off base here, that it feels like the health metric is almost like a red herring in comparison to taste and price. But again,
I fully agree. Taste and price will be the main determinants for the choice. Yeah. We need to try to change that, or try to provide the same taste at an affordable price. And I think that has been the challenge that faced by the innovations at this time. And as I said in the talk, the health case is not really made yet. So you cannot really say this is healthier or not, because it hasn't been made. We need to wait a couple of years that someone runs a proper randomized control trial and so on, and provide the health effects of the innovative products.
Excellent. I think that's a really good place to stop and to move on to our next speaker. Great pleasure to introduce my very good friend, Clare Mills, who's going to talk about food safety, consideration of alternative proteins. So Clare is a professor at the University of Manchester in molecular allergology. Is that how I say it?
Yeah.
And has led a number of European projects, and including coordinating an EFSA project called Thrall. I think Clare doesn't really need much introduction. Suffice to say that she's really one of the top experts in her field in allergenicity. So Clare, can I just hand over to you and say thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Louise, for the introduction and the invitation to speak. And I just want to check, are my slides presenting okay? That's great. Okay, so I will get on without more ado. And I hope that this works. Yes, my declaration of interest, funding that I get from various research councils and industrial collaborations, and includes shares in a biopharmaceutical startup reactor biotech. So thinking about the title of the talk, I was also considering about where all these different types of alternative proteins could be sourced, and the two talks that precede this have really introduced the topic very well. I've got a slightly different take on it, coming at it from a safety point of view, but we've got things like plant-derived proteins from existing or new crops. We've got microbes, so this is Fusarium venenatum, which is the filamentous algae that is in corn, but we also have other fungi, bacteria. We've got microalgae, things like cultured meat, and insects. So what do we need to think about in terms of their safety? Now, what I'm going to talk to you is very much European based, but I know, for example, in the USA, these kind of novel foods, as we would call them in Europe, and I'm going to say we, because UK legislation is the same as European legislation at the moment. But in the US, you have the concept of generally recognized as safe. However, that still requires the same sorts of information, and you often find data that goes into GRAS applications in the US is also seen in novel foods dossiers within the EU. So in the EU and the UK, we have two different routes whereby these alternative protein sources would be regulated. So the first of these is traditional foods from what are called third countries, i.e. that includes the UK, but the UK would treat the rest of the world like that. And this is applicable to foods with a 25-year history of use, and you have to demonstrate that they've been in the customary diet of a significant number of people in at least one third country. If not, if you don't satisfy that, then you have to go through the main novel foods regulation, where actually it covers food and food ingredients with a new or intentionally modified structure, and food ingredients consisting of or isolated from microorganisms, so fungi or microalgae, plants or animal foods, except those obtained by traditional propagation or breeding. And what I will say, because it was mentioned in the first talk about GM has a completely separate regulatory framework, and I won't be talking about that today. Now, in actual fact, all of the foods, you have classical hazards from microbiological to chemical contaminants, and they all need to be considered. So when we look at all our new alternative protein sources, I'm afraid actually they are all going to count as novel foods, and there will need to be some kind of application and process, whether you're going in the USA where you need a GRAS status, or you're going through biting the bullet and going through novel foods. So what are the safety issues? Well, that depends on their origin, and some of the new technology that we're getting coming through, very exciting, and new processing technology like the 3D printing also gets regulated under the same framework. In actual fact, it depends on how you're making it, it depends on their origin. So let's think about plant proteins from traditional plant sources. Now, these are two food ingredients that have gone through this novel foods process. The first is a protein isolate from oilseed. It isn't the first one, it's the first one on my slide. And in actual fact, that was approved. It was actually developed as an animal feed first, and then it gradually got upgraded, and it's now had a novel foods approval in Europe for human food use. And the sorts of things that had to be considered in that safety issue was things like erucic acid and glucosinolates, and the way in which they addressed that. So it wasn't a barrier to the approval, it had to be addressed. And it had to be addressed using cultivars naturally low in those compounds and developing a production process that further reduced those compounds. So this is where you can address the food safety hazards often by managing them, and by managing them right across your process. And so you have to design your safety in right from the very beginning. One of the first applications that got approved actually was a protein isolate from alfalfa, and here there were hazards such as phytoestrogens, but they were present in foods at similar levels to soybean, and L-carnitine, which is associated with systemic lupus erythematosus, but the levels are lower than other foods, and there was no evidence of anti-DNA antibody generation. So these both got approved. So yes, you do need to collect the information together, but I don't know many people in the food industry who actually want to hurt anybody with their products. But it's about having that safety engineered at the beginning. Now, I've actually been working in food research long enough to remember the development of corn, and I started out working on trichothecene mycotoxins. And actually, it's very interesting because corn, which actually they can't make enough of, and it comes from the fact it was predicted back in the 1960s that there would be a shortage of protein-rich foods. And in response to that, something called mycoprotein was developed, which is based on Fusarium venenatum. Now, in actual fact, it's grown in very large scale, and there was permission granted for its use in 1985 after a 10-year evaluation programme. What the issues were with corn for the safety assessment were two. So first of all was mycotoxins. So in actual fact, venenatum, like all Fusarium species, carries the genes for making mycotoxins, such as deoxynivalenol and T2 toxin. Consequently, what they had to do was test every single batch, which is where I was involved because I was in a group that actually did that. And actually, they've never had a problem with mycotoxin contamination in corn. It's been managed out of the entire system. The other risk was allergenicity, which was beginning to come onto the radar at that time. But in actual fact, what we can see based on what's been published in the literature is there is only one case report of an individual with IgE-mediated allergic reactions to the Fusarium itself. And obviously, there hasn't been the consumption of corn that there has been of other types of foods like peanut, etc., that we commonly think of as food allergens. But it's actually safe, generally safe, and had very few problems. So there's some really good precedents of how to manage it. When we come to think about microalgae, and I have the pleasure of working with Alison Smith from the University of Cambridge, who's an expert in algae, and she's been teaching me a lot. And I have to say, I did not realise how diverse they were, and that it both embraces prokaryotic blue-green algae and diverse eukaryotic algae comprising 20 different phyla. They are very complicated and very diverse. So we can't really put them all in one pot. And actually that means the safety assessments that are done for one particular type of microalgae may not work for another. But there are some commonalities and things that we're going to have to watch out for. So again, toxins. And we've all heard about issues of algal blooms on water causing problems with toxins being produced. And these molecules are incredibly complex to analyse. These are just 3 of them, and it includes things like microcystin, which are hepatotoxins. You've got alkaloids such as saxitoxin, which is a neurotoxin, and polyketides such as ciguatoxin. And some of them are involved in shellfish poisoning, which we classically have heard of, where they get concentrated up inside the shellfish. All the algal species currently used for food do not make toxins, but it might be, if you're going to look at algae, that it will be important to identify whether they have the capacity to produce toxins. And one of the things with microalgae is, because they're small organisms, they have small genomes, and the advances in genome sequencing make it much easier to do this sort of looking for toxin production and predicting it from the genome sequence. And you can manage it exactly the same as you potentially can for corn to ensure that your algae do not necessarily make nasty toxins. There are also other issues about accumulation of chemical contaminants. So PCBs, dioxins, heavy metals, pesticides, all the classical chemical safety issues that we have for all the foods that we eat, they need to be considered. And that relates to understanding how your methods of cultivation and the control of water quality used for culture and the algal species used all work together to prevent or manage that accumulation. And I think one of the things that I can see, and going through this talk actually was very useful for me, is you can see that actually to make food for humans to eat, you need high quality feedstocks that are going into your production. If they're not high quality, you will get problems in the final product. And it may well be that some of the things that have been published about using waste streams and using marginal land may actually be more difficult if you want to use these organisms for food. Now, it's interesting about insects and the fact that consumers really don't like them. I find it fascinating because the insects of the sea that we eat all the time, which are called shrimp, which if you actually look at them, they really are quite hideous. Invertebrates of the seas and rivers, and they are the kind of insects that you might eat and have been eaten in many parts of the world, are actually very closely related to them. We've also always eaten them because there are small levels of insects that are allowed in agricultural products because they're very difficult to get out. So the sorts of safety considerations you need to think about with insects is, well, are you consuming them whole? Do they have parts that actually could represent a choking hazard or all sorts of things you want to move stingers? So there's issues of removing body parts. They also can accumulate chemical contaminants such as PCBs and dioxins. They can produce toxins and anti-nutritional factors. And there are also concerns about the potential for processing contaminants. Now, interestingly, the European Food Safety Authority published recently their safety assessment of dried yellow mealworm larvae as a novel food. And what they found in practice, so this is for mealworms, either given as snacks. I must admit, I'm not sure I'd want to eat them as snacks, but at a level of 10% as a food ingredient, in biscuits, pasta and legume dishes, and sports nutrition supplements. So what did they find? Well, bioaccumulation of dioxins and PCBs, so that had to be managed by ensuring the feed had no detectable dioxin or PCB, so you have to monitor the feed going into the insects. Arsenic was actually accumulated, and they did have reasonable levels of both arsenic and a mycotoxin called octoxin. But the way EFSA assessed this was by exposure assessments based on this 10% in foods, was that really the contribution to the diet with the intended use was negligible, and other mycotoxins and pesticide levels were not an issue. Toxins and anti-nutrients were present at similar levels to other foods. So really good news, and they did conclude that it was generally safe for us to eat yellow mealworms. There was a concern about chitin and the chitin content, so it's a new thing. If you start eating a lot of it, we have issues that we don't have methods for determination of chitin that are properly validated. And there are issues over trying to convert to protein content. These are nitty-gritty things that affect the safety assessment, but will also follow on into how you use this material as a food ingredient. And there are potentially immune modulating effects. So one of the things that's not clear is whether the observation on the chemical contaminants and natural toxins for mealworm are generalizable to other insect species in the same way as algae are very diverse, so are insects. And I think we just have to see what happens with some of the other dossiers that are being assessed at the moment. So we've already heard about cultured meat. And this is really quite fascinating from a regulatory point of view, because we haven't ever made cell cultures to eat before. And these issues of cell isolation, immortalization, materials used for cell culture, hygiene and the nutritional quality. There are some legal issues that we don't know what we're going to call it. Is it meat or isn't it meat? But safety issues that relate to how you grow these, and issues such as viral contamination of cell cultures. We have to develop a safety framework for actually looking at cultured meat. It does fall within the novel foods regulations, but it will present some interesting questions, which actually we probably should deal with in research projects rather than expecting applicants to sort them out. Now, the second part of my talk really relates to one of the big things that has really faced anybody going to do a safety assessment on an alternative protein, and that's to do with its allergenicity. So the idea really came about the issues for novel foods came from GM, where in order to improve the nutritional quality for soybean back in the 1990s, a molecular biologist put the 2S-albumin storage protein from Brazil nut into soybeans. There was this amazing paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where the team at the University of Nebraska showed that if you had a Brazil nut allergy and you had IgE, this is an immunoblot showing that the IgE from the patient binds to the 2S-albumin in Brazil nuts, so that's allergenic, and actually, lo and behold, your soybean, which is expressing that protein, was also allergenic. So it made it the ultimate hidden allergen. And we've moved on an awful lot since then. We have a very detailed framework for assessing genetically modified organisms. And actually that has been very much used and built on within Europe to produce the weight of evidence approach that is also being applied to the allergenicity risk assessment of novel proteins. And this has a whole series of things that we work through. Is the new protein, to kind of conclude, is the new protein likely to be allergenic? Going through various different tests. So since almost all food allergens are proteins, the allergenic potential for a novel food, such as a highly refined oil or a hydrolysate, is very low. No protein, no problem. However, if you have a novel protein, you have to think about where it's come from, the source, the production process, and experimental and human data. And through the cost action impetus, this put together this kind of nice, clear framework. If you like, the first step of your risk assessment is really to take your new protein and say, well, how's it related to anything we know that's an allergen? What are the proteins in it? How are you going to use it? Could it cause a reaction in somebody who's already got a food allergy? So does it cause a reaction in somebody with a peanut allergy? And in actual fact, we can do step 1 and step 2A with a reasonable level of assurance. What is very difficult to do is to understand whether a new protein has the potential to generate a new de novo sensitization. This schema does not involve using animal models, but undoubtedly in the risk assessment, one would use potentially animal models if you needed to. And that is a big problem for a lot of the food industry, where animal models are a no-no. And we do need to get some more better cell-based models that perhaps could be an alternative to animal models in this process. So step 1, the first thing you do, so it could be a transgene sequence, or it could be the sequences of your proteins in your novel source, and you look for a database and you look to see whether there's an allergen that looks like your protein, your new protein. And that gives you a very good idea of potential allergen risk. So this is what they did for the shrimp, the tropomyosin. So tropomyosin is a major allergen in shrimps, and if you look in insect, there is a similar tropomyosin, and it has been known for some time that the IgE in people with shrimp allergy binds to tropomyosin, also binds to the tropomyosin from insects, and it causes cross-reactive allergy syndromes. And this is nice work on the IgE reactivity from 3 different mealworm preparations, and this is the shrimp extract, and you can see the IgE from patient 1, patient 5 binds very strongly to the shrimp, but it also binds to the equivalent protein in the mealworm, and that's also shown here in another type of assay demonstrating allergic potential. And this went one step further, and in actual fact, the team in Utrecht fed mealworm protein to people with shrimp allergy and showed that it causes an allergic reaction. So there is actually no doubt that mealworm protein is allergenic. However, I suspect, and we don't know yet because DG Santé has yet to deliberate, but the evidence is it's allergenic, so that becomes a risk management problem. And of course, one of the ways of managing allergenic risks is just putting it on the label. So what they did with oilseed rape protein was that it was very similar to mustard protein, and DG Santé just put it on the label. So I think it's highly likely that we will end up with an approval. Bets in a sealed envelope. I have no inside knowledge on this, but I think it's highly likely that it will get approved for use, and it will end up having to be labelled, and we will need tools for managing mealworm proteins as allergens. So this is just a quick example about predicting sensitization and the uncertainty of it. So using chia seeds. So we've done many applications for novel foods where chia seeds have been approved, and obviously they're seeds, they're full of protein, and you've got the full complement of proteins there. Chia seeds are not from a food that's on Annex 2, which is the labelling list of priority allergenic foods in Europe. And taxonomically, it's not related to any known allergen or allergen family, so it got its approval. However, kind of like 5-6 years down the line, actually there is some evidence that chia seeds can act as allergens. And This is a patient who ate Chia every day in yogurt and developed eczema. They've got multiple sensitization to other foods, including tree nuts and legumes, and it looks like they're sensitized to the storage proteins in the Chia seeds. So allergenicity is a very, risk assessment is an uncertain process. Now, there are lots of management decisions that have to be made. I'm involved in providing scientific advice through the Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes to the UK Food Standards Agency. Our role is to provide the science, they do the risk management. But I think there are a number of things we really need to square this off and avoid it becoming a barrier, and feeding into uncertainty over consumer acceptance of foods, because if they get worried that it's going to cause an allergy, people might be reluctant to adopt new technology, which we urgently need. So we need better models, cell models that can predict sensitization potential. We need far better ways of monitoring allergies after they've been introduced onto the market. This is just to show you, this is a summary of fatal reactions that was published earlier on this year in the UK, going back to 1992 through to 2013 and 2015. What's interesting is peanut, it kind of goes up and down, wiggles around. What's been very interesting was that between 1992 and 1996, there was no record of a fatality to milk. But actually in 2013, 2015, milk was the most significant cause of allergic reactions. So whether there are things changing in our allergic population. And this is where food allergens challenge safety paradigms. Dioxins are carcinogens, whatever time of year you might have had them. The problem with allergies is they change, and they will change over time as a consequence of our change in dietary habits, change in exposure, climate change, all sorts of things. The last thing I think we need to consider is labelling for consumers to enable that monitoring to be joined up, and we need to have patient and clinical community involved in this. So that's it, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Claire. We do actually have a question in the chat from Bert.
Two questions.
Okay, two, and now another one. Okay, so Bert's question is around mycoproteins. So he said that corn in Europe comes with an allergenicity warning on its products, saying that some people have had allergic reactions to it. And he's just asking about, if there's no issue, why would a company put a voluntary label on?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. Now, we've studied the prevalence of food allergies in unselected study populations through the EuroPreval project, and there are others who've studied it in Australia, particularly. We've got good data, China, Australia. We've never recorded anybody with a corn allergy. And I think that that may be just that the incidence is very, very low. It's way lower than things like soybean, which is about 0.2% of the population have an allergy to soybean. So whatever corn is, it is not an allergenic food that is of sufficient prevalence to be considered a priority allergenic food. There are people who have reactions to foods, everything from raspberries to lettuce and cabbage somewhere in the world. But certainly the evidence is that corn is not a major important allergen that causes a source of severe reactions. So I can't comment as to why the company has done that, but sometimes people do put things on labels because they want to reduce liability. But it's not anything that any regulatory body has required.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's...
There is a question from a colleague of mine, it's which allergenic food source has the highest prevalence of food allergen in adults? And she thanks you for your nice presentation.
Okay, thank you. Actually, in adults, it's probably peanut, although that depends on where you are in the world, and that's very interesting because in Europe, it's hazelnut. Okay. I think that's because the Europeans love eating Nutella, and we actually don't have really good quality data from the USA, but in Canada peanut is a really important allergy in adulthood.
But as far as I know, there could be variations in, for example, in a country, depending on the area where you live, in the north or in the south, because of what you have been used to eat, or yeah?
Well, within Europe, there's a very interesting north-south divide. And so in the north of Europe, we have a lot of food allergy that is related to sensitization to birch pollen. And so you get people with mild allergies, often, not always, but mild generally, to things like hazelnut and apple. If you go to the Mediterranean area, you can get severe anaphylactic reactions to things like peach and other types of fresh fruit and vegetables, and it's driven by a molecule called LTP. You talk to the Spanish clinicians, they are very, very good at dealing with people with multiple food allergies with very severe reactions. So it does vary. It's amazing geographically.
Yeah, thank you.
So do we have time for one more question, Catherine, or should we move on?
Perhaps Emanuele have a question, a rapid one, a quick one.
Hmm?
We can't hear you. Your microphone is on the right.
We will need Emmanuel's microphone anyway, so this is a good time.
Now can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Perfect. No, I think I was muted by the organizer, so I couldn't switch off. Claire, thank you so much for the nice presentation. I have a question for you. Protein allergies, do you think is much more related to the quantity of protein rather than the quality? The protein that we are eating.
Yeah.
Because you were mentioning, you know, regarding the Chia allergy, and well, a guy was eating every day Chia in the yogurt.
Well, it's true to say that if you don't eat it, you won't get allergic to it. Okay, so in that sense, consumption is important, and it may, you know, maybe it says that there are people eating more fruit in the Mediterranean countries than the north of Europe, which is probably actually almost certainly true. So certainly, the more you eat it, the more likely you are to get allergic to it if you are predisposed. But what is quite clear from our epidemiology studies is that the predisposition to becoming allergic is different around the world. So if you go to India, there's almost no food allergy. And in our European study, in Greece, I don't know what they're doing in Athens, but they had the lowest rates of food allergy compared to, say, Zurich or the UK or the Netherlands or parts of France. So this is highly heterogeneous. The capital for food allergy in the world is Melbourne in Australia. We don't understand why this is. And to be honest, until we understand the mechanism behind food allergy, we will never be able to really predict what is allergenic or not. I think we just have to try and manage it and understand what's going on.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are now switching to the fourth and last talk. I'm sorry for the question. There are a lot for you, Claire, but we don't have time to answer everything. So this session will be entitled Nutrition and Alternative Proteins. It will be presented by Dr. Emanuele Zannini, PhD in Applied Biomolecular Science and also PhD in Food Science. Emanuele is Senior Research Coordinator at the School of Food and Nutritional Sciences at the University College Cork in Ireland. He is strongly interested in the medical nutritional therapy and was the scientific advisor of the Age 2020 Protein to Food project, and he is currently the coordinator of the Age 2020 Smart Protein project, aiming at developing the next generation of smart protein foods which are cost-effective, resource-efficient, affordable, and nutritious. So, Emanuele, the floor is yours. I think you should speak closer to your microphone because we heard there is an echo. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yeah, fine.
Perfect. Thank you, Catherine, for the nice introduction. And thank you everybody for the organizer for inviting me to this very interesting conference. Let's start with the meaning of food, or actually the evolution of the meaning of food through the last centuries. Now, from the 50s, consumers were perceiving food as a way to get calories, to get nutrients. But then you see, basically, by moving towards the 80s, the 90s, consumers were much more focusing on something more than that. So looking for foods that basically were providing health, protect, prevent from non-communicable disease. And now we end nowadays where food is perceived as a way to treat medical conditions. So you see, basically, there's been a huge jump in terms of the meaning of that food has for consumers. So, but besides the fact that basically the food let's say, concept has been evolved dramatically, at the same time, we saw that this evolution got some cost, and in particular, in the environmental, let's say, in particular, environmental cost associated with food production. As you see here, basically, if we are keeping using our food in the way we're used to for the last, let's say, 50 years, in 2050, we need 3 planets of natural resources to make sure that basically we can feed everybody. And for this reason, also, the European Union actually is acting very strongly in this area, And in particular, they launched last year the new Green Deal, and basically that aim to change the way we are producing, we are processing, we are consuming, and we are disposing our food. And this is very, very, very important. If you want to be a leader in the food transition that basically we are facing nowadays. Well, I'm saying this because if you see some of the vital indicators, you see that basically we are in the way we are managing our planet. We see that our CO2 concentration is rising, temperatures now are climbing, and landfill is suffering. But in the meantime, you see that basically the population is growing, and even as more people than ever before are overweight and obese. So definitely there is something wrong, something that needs to be changed, and something needs to be changed now. So. And this actually is particularly evident when we see the different food system limitation that basically we are facing nowadays. As you see here, pointer, yes, here. We see basically one out of 3 people suffer from malnutrition. We have a third of our food is basically wasted, got in the bin. And our food is also too rich in fat, sugar, salt, and meat. So we need to restructure the way we are receiving food. And also at the same time, we are producing this food at the expense of the natural resources. So definitely we need to also make sure that the different actors that play their role in the food system will start speaking the same language. So we need to remove this silo thinking behavior among different players in the food system, starting from government, producer, consumers, and business people. So smart protein was actually aiming to start producing differently and eat differently in a way that basically the food is gonna be produced will be healthier, and also we are aiming to make sure that we have a fair income distribution and not among the actors in the food system. This is something that's very important, and also to in a way give acknowledge the key role, in particular the primary producer have in preserve and protect our planet. Definitely, as you see here, in 2050, there is a question mark in what we are going to eat. So, and that's why we are now, the EU Commission is actually investing a lot of effort financially in basically developing alternative solutions that basically will help us to move towards a fair and just transition. And of course, in doing this, we have to answer 3 different questions. How to ensure how to ensure nutrition, healthy and sustainable food for everybody, how to set up a food circularity, and how to restore diversity. Well, this is the main answer, the main question that basically Smart Protein is trying to answer with an impressive consortium from 23 different partners. You see mainly from Europe, also from States and Israel and Switzerland. So, and a very good team. We are making sure that basically we are taking into consideration any step that basically need to taken to make sure that basically we can deliver and reach a safe and just operation space, because that's what is the more important. Of course, beside the number of parties that basically involved in this project, is mainly focused on plant. And there is a reason why. Because is one of the few protein sources that basically are intimately connected with the environment. The idea here is to produce more better with less. So we are taking into consideration also the fact that basically to produce a nutritious food, we need also to have or improve the soil fertility in order to make sure that basically this could happen. So we are taking a holistic approach, in particular, entirely from farm to fork. Different sources will be taken into consideration, but the byproducts from pasta, bakery and brewery side streams will be used for growing eastern mushrooms, and also chickpea, lentil, quinoa, and fabrini will be the protein source that really will be taken into consideration. And we're starting from selecting varieties, developing new processing, extraction, and fractionation, and then on food development. Of course, the main goal is to deliver a wide range of food products from fish and seafood, pastry, cheese, meat, infant food, and make alternatives. Of course, the main target, the main challenge that we are facing at the moment is to make sure that basically the process and the product that we're going to develop will be natural, will be tasty, will have an appealing texture, appearance, but also be affordable. So this is another aspect that basically most of the time companies that are developing alternative food, alternative plant-based products, they're not taking consideration. In order to make sure that the mass market will embrace or will face the opportunity to enjoy, embrace this protein transition, we need to make sure that the product we develop will be also affordable for them. So definitely, as I mentioned before, Smart Protein is focusing on three main routes to and make sure that this transition will happen. So starting from agricultural development, also primary production using regenerative agriculture. So basically regenerating our environment, our soil, in order to make sure that basically the environment and the planet will always be able to feed us. At the same time, developing new sustainable food production and food processing, and also endorsing circularity. This is another aspect that basically we're going to address significantly. So in a few words, we try to build back better after the pandemic. So as you saw from the previous speakers, also from Armando, from the Good Food Institute, alternative proteins is on the way now to, let's say, rise in the next 10 years. And definitely, the reason why, in particular, plant protein is not seen a brilliant future is because they're still perceived by consumers as healthier and also and much more sustainable than animal food products. Of course, there are several challenges that need to be taken into consideration that we're going to address this in a few minutes. Of course, when we are thinking about what we should do and what should be the trends and how we're going to shape the plant-based foods, taste and texture are the primary aspect that we should take into consideration. People say that basically, yes, I want to shift to more plant diet, more plant, diet because I care environment. And then the ultimate choice will be only, approaching foods that basically are, let's say, resemble or provoking pleasure when they are consumed. It has to be convenient, so easy to process, and also definitely able to improve the health status of the consumers, but also supporting them in the weight management. Protein content is important, but definitely something even more important is the quality of the protein. You know, because this is one of the weak points, and most of the time, you know, food products basically containing high plant proteins have been accused not to. And of course, environmental concern is also something very important. As I mentioned before, regenerative agriculture, this is the most important to make sure that we are reshaping the food environment in which consumers are purchasing, processing, and disposing food. Reconnect the consumers with the primary production, with the process, to make sure that basically they get familiar, they understand the meaning and the power of the daily choice when they basically go to the grocery. Of course, we are working on plant protein since 2015, when the EU Commission was actually funding a project called Protein to Food, where I was actually partner and scientific advisor. And here I want to just give you share with you a short video where basically summarize the main outcomes of the protein to food. I don't hear the sound, so that's fitting. Can someone else tell me if the sound is there?
We can't hear the sound. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Stop it here. Fitting. But definitely, there is a protein to food website where basically you will have a chance to see all the outcomes that basically have been published, has been achieved, all the scientific publication has been released, and they are basically open access. So everybody will have access to the outcomes that have been delivered. Here, I want to just give you a short overview about the main achievement that we got on protein to food. And as I mentioned before, we were not targeting different plant protein, and one of them was actually lentil. And here you can see, and we were using lentil for basically developing infant food formula, plant-based infant food formula. As you see here, when we're talking about plant protein, definitely there is so many advantages, but also there are some challenges that basically need to be faced in order to make sure that basically the full potential of this protein will be embraced. First of all, the food map content. This is something very important that potentially most of the time companies are underestimating. The food map actually are considered main responsible for IBS. In Europe, around 20% of people suffering from different degree of IBS. So there are fermentable oligosaccharide, monosaccharides, and polyols. And in particular, legumes are quite rich in these compounds. So their extraction process and the fractionation actually really help to reduce significant amount of these compounds that basically could potentially challenge our consumers. At the same time, also here in particular, we were comparing two different extraction process. And you see basically from isoelectric precipitation and ultrafiltration. So two different extraction process from lentils. And you see basically that both processes were helping us to significantly reduce the food map content, and also the trypsin inhibitors, so the anti-nutrients that basically sometimes are associated with the legumes, and also definitely improving the lentil protein digestibility. So you see, by processing the raw material, we can actually deliver ingredients that basically will match the nutritional quality that basically we are looking for. Here in the case of the fava bean protein, we were basically investigating again here 2 different extraction methods, and also we evaluate the in vitro protein digestibility. As you can see also here that as we see for the lentil proteins, the extraction process was significantly able to reduce the food map contents in these ingredients, so basically reducing the risk to create IBS symptoms in our consumers, significantly also reduce the anti-nutrients, in particular vicin and combicin, now quite known allergenic in the fava bean, and also the in vitro protein digestibility was significantly improved as well. So as you see here, there is a plus and a negative aspects in processing legumes protein. One side, you are reducing some of the anti-nutrients or some of the compounds that basically could have a negative effect on human health. At the other side, you potentially you are depriving the ingredients of some of the micronutrients that basically could actually be relevant. And I'm speaking about minerals, for example, that are actually very, very, very relevant. Okay. As I mentioned before, in this work, we were actually using lentil protein for developing an infant food formula. And as you see, also here, the results demonstrate that the particle size distribution was very, very uniform and fine compared to the soy-based formula and the rice-based formula. And also this actually allow to show a better technological performance when the powder will be rehydrated. At the same time, also the protein digestibility was actually, the in vitro protein digestibility was actually important and relevant. Of course, much lower than the rice-based formula, but that's because in that case we were using protein hydrolysate to develop the infant formula. So again here, the model lentil formula has a similar digestibility and physical stability value of a commercial soy-based formula. So it could be considered as an alternative solution. Of course, this was a starting point of an investigation. Now on the smart protein and follow-up projects, basically we are moving to an industrialization, so an validation demonstration of this technology and these ingredients at industrial scales involving nutrition. And of course, again here, Armando before was actually talking about developing new food categories, and he was mentioning bread and pasta. In this case, we were actually using different protein from buckwheat, fava bean, and gluten for developing, high protein ivory pasta. And we see here, when we're developing these particular products, you also have technological challenges, because in the pasta you have the al dente effect, so the strengths of the pasta need to be kept even after, not during the cooking, at the same and also the consistency of the pasta itself. And you see here basically that when we did an in vitro digestibility and in vivo nitrogen balance, the protein efficiency rate was actually improved when a combination of different protein sources would be used, and by replace a portion of wheat flour. As well, here you can see the trypsin, the vicin, and combicin was actually significantly reduced, in particular after the pasta was cooked. So also the process, the technological process, we actually have huge influence in modulating these compounds. Here also, again, we were using the same approach for the bread production, and also again we saw that a different combination of protein was actually allowed to develop a better amino acids profile in their products. Also, the protein digestibility was actually improved, and also the anti-nutrients compound was actually significantly reduced as well. So there is a way to now successfully incorporate these protein ingredients in different food categories. And I mentioned here a few of them, but there is a wide range of potential. Of course, the last but not the least, we were also working on the plant-based milk substitute. And definitely the main force that guide consumers towards this new type of products is with digestive wellness. As Clare was mentioned before, lactose intolerance or allergenicity seems rising, and that's also the reason why consumers are much more focused in alternative solutions. And the reason why you see basically the increase in the market trends now for the next couple of years. When we decide to focus and work on this, we just have a look on what was on the market. And then we just have a quick look on the composition to see basically that what we are having is healthy. I'm not saying healthier than milk, but healthy. And that's what we saw. Basically, we compare the composition, the visual appearance, the physicochemical properties, and the glycemic properties. But we saw that basically half of the sample had very low protein content. So what they were doing, basically, they were selling water and sugar. And only soy was actually the milk, the plant-based milk, basically could have a considerably high amount of protein. And also you see basically here the separation rate was basically show a poor suspension stability without stabilizer. Only soy-based products show good results. The carbohydrates, consider low carbohydrate content, rise due to the starch. The starch basically showed very high glucose content. Also, you see basically the in vitro glycemic index. You see the coconut and the rice milk was basically very, very high. So when you approach this product, you think it's much healthier, or this it could be another solution for your problem. But then when you look to this data, you see basically you have to be careful when you are choosing what you're purchasing. So definitely products with high glycemic index, low protein content, low suspension stability, low mineral and vitamin content, especially when compared to milk. So definitely there are room for improvement. Now using different technology, different ingredient, processing, enzyme fermentation. Here are just the last slides. I want to show you basically what we did. And we were using here, in this case, we were using completely different approach. We didn't functionalize, we didn't purify protein. We used the whole flour, in particular starting from quinoa, and using different enzymatic process, amylase and protease. We were able to improve protein solubility and the protein content in this water extract, also to convert the glucose in fructose by glucosamine, and then by fermentation we were converting fructose in mannitol. So basically reducing the glucose content, but also the glycemic index. So there is a way to improve basically the products technologically in terms of texture, flavor, but also on nutritional perspective. So definitely there are several hurdles still not that busy need to be overcome before a great proportion of the population adopt this type of food products. Definitely consumer hardness. We need to make sure that basically consumers understand and perceive the relevance on this protein transition. Nowadays, when I'm going to purchase a steak, I'm not paying the real value, the real cost of the steak, because I'm not paying, the consumers are not taking into consideration the environmental cost associated with the purchase of the steak. And this is something that basically needs to be taken into consideration. Technological hardness. Definitely here we have the tools to functionalize proteins in a way that basically will fulfill our expectation in terms of texture, color, flavor, and aroma. Definitely, as I mentioned before, commercialization hurdles. We need to make sure that the ingredients we are delivering are affordable and have a relatively low cost. And this is very important. Otherwise, you know, we always have the lifestyle consumers embracing our products, but never the mass market. And the mass market, I think, we need to make sure that the change will happen.
Emanuele, I'm sorry, we are out of time.
Okay. The last, nutrition.
Thank you.
Definitely, we understand basically how the impact of differences in protein digestion, digestibility, absorption, satiety, amino acid profile, and allergenicity. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for your really interesting presentation. So I don't see any new question in the audience, perhaps because it is a little bit late here in some areas. So perhaps I would like to ask you concerning the fact that there are pros and cons concerning the use of technology to improve or to improve proteins or not. How can we manage the problem of ultra processed food perception in the consumer, from a consumer perspective?
Well, this is a quite challenging question. Definitely, this is an aspect that basically we have to take in consideration and not underestimate when we are developing alternative food products. And particularly because people say, okay, I'm eating meat that contains just one ingredient, and then you ask me to replace this meat with someone else that basically mock meat, but that contains 20 ingredients in. So also there is a big question, and there's a question mark on sustainability again. As a scientist, I would say processed food is not a bad thing, because processed food means basically that the raw material, and then we understand from the previous speaker that sometimes you will not always have optimal raw material. So processing will actually have to let's say to improve significantly also the safety of the products that basically you are going to produce.
Mm-hmm.
So this is again what I mentioned before. You know, the consumers' challenge here is to educate, you know, as the consumer side, to educate consumers to really understand what the words mean, because sometimes you know there are what I found very interesting. They are listening to the discussion that basically are much more closer to their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not willing to, let's say, okay, let's start from scratch, you know, challenge me and I challenge you and see basically where we go, where we are headed, you know. And there is much more, let's say, a believer approach here, and it's something that basically has to be changed, because we have the tools, I think, and the EU, in particular, the EU Commission is doing a lot of effort in also in educating consumers to make the better choice, and you know, and for them, and also for the kids as well. So the ultra process is also the point is depends how far you go, because I know there are companies that basically are pushing in this direction, and then you're handing, you know, with I can speak about the gluten-free area, for example. You know, most of the time they are just pure starch and hydrocolloids and water. The first ingredients of gluten-free bread is actually water. So, and then you see basically here, you're losing some of the micronutrients that you need. And then when people say vegan or vegetarian diet is much healthier than others, then you have to step back and say, hold on, it's healthier if we are considering all the nutrients, the micronutrients that basically that we can get from the raw materials. But when we are moving to highly processed food, this, say, this concept, granted concept, is not that granted anymore. It has to be basically really taken into consideration.
Thank you. Stefan, I think we don't have any more time for a question. Yeah, sorry. Sorry for people who asked lately.
I would like to thank our co-chair, Dr. Louise Dye, Dr. Catherine Millot. I want to thank our 4 speakers. I think it was a very enlightening session on a very timely topic, a lot still to be done. I hope we will be able to follow up in the years to come with another session on alternative protein. I invite you to join us to our next session in 2 hours. Might be late in Europe, will be early in Asia. But it will be also a very interesting session on greenhouse gas from the food supply chain, past to mitigation and sustainability. We're lucky to have Dr. Ratan Lal, the 2020 World Food Prize, that will also speak to us. So once again, thank you all, and I wish you a good evening or a good day, depending on where you are. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.